Welcome to the School of Policy Studies at Queen's. My name's David Walker and I'm director of the school. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today for this very special occasion. I'm going to say a few words at first about the Courchene lecture series, and then I'm going to hand over to Christine, who's going to introduce our special speaker. So welcome, and this is the 2019 Tom Courchene Distinguished Speaker Series. And welcome particularly to Margie and Tom Courchene and members of their family who've made this possible. If it was not for you, this would not be happening. So thank you very much. The Margie and Tom Courchene Endowment Fund was established to create a permanent speaker series in the School of Policy Studies to be known subsequently as the Tom Courchene Distinguished Speaker Series. It continues the tradition that Tom established as the inaugural director of this School of Policy Studies to serve as a bridge between the academic and professional policy communities, engaging faculty, students, policymakers, politicians, and other opinion leaders in discussion on major policy issues. Tom is well known to Queen's, Kingston, Canada, and beyond as a distinguished and acclaimed economist, an officer of the Order of Canada, a prolific academic, an author, a friend of this school, and a wonderful golfer. His most recent book, Indigenous Nationals, Canadian Citizens, has been nominated for the Donner Prize. So congratulations, Tom, and thank you, Tom and Margie, for making this event possible. I'll now turn the proceedings over thank you very much. I'll now turn the proceedings over to Christine Shawanung, who will, as is our way, introduce our special speaker.
Thank you. Sego, Anine, and good afternoon, students, faculty, and community members, and welcome to the 2019 lecture in the Tom Courchene Distinguished Speaker Series, presented by the School of Policy Studies. My name is Christine Shawana, and I'm an MPA candidate of the class of 2019. I'm a Mohawk Turtle clan belonging to Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I would like to say and acknowledge that Queen sits on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. And I would like to introduce Dr. Cindy Blackstock. I am honored. It is my pleasure. Dr. Cindy Blackstock is the Executive Director of First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. She will be speaking on the Spirit Bearers' plan to end inequalities in public services for First Nations children, youth, and families. A member of the Gitksan First Nation, Cindy Blackstock has 25 years of social work experience in child protection and Indigenous children rights. Her promotion of culturally based, evidence-informed solutions has been recognized by the Nobel Women's Initiative, the Aboriginal Achievement Foundation, Frontline Defenders, and many others. Dr. Cindy Blackstock has collaborated with other Indigenous leaders to assist the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Child in development and adoption of a general comment on the rights of Indigenous children. Her talk is sure to get us thinking and asking questions. Please use slido.com to ask those questions using the hashtag MPA19. Those watching via live stream can also ask questions using Slido. If you don't have a question, you can vote on other questions that are of interest to you. As in the past, we will post the questions with the most votes. We will also take a few questions from the crowd. You are invited to stay for the reception, which will take place immediately after the lecture. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Cindy Blackstock.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, what a great honor, to be here on these territories and for this lecture series. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Margie, for this opportunity. It is an absolute honor. And for those of you, thankfully, the bookstores will still be open when this lecture ends, and this is a copy of Tom's book, so please do take a good read of it. This is an important time in the history of our country. An important time when we can actually get to the heart of colonialism. Because colonialism, as Robert Williams, the great Native American legal scholar, said, is really about a bifurcation of the world into two words, the savage and the civilized. And from that kind of context grew countries like Canada, like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand, and many other nation states as well. The deeming of Indigenous peoples as savage, the deeming of Indigenous peoples as lawless, the deeming of Indigenous peoples as unable, incapable of raising their own children, provided the platform for the rationalization of what is theft and immoral behavior under any other circumstance. But when you dehumanize people by using the savage and civilized dichotomy, many things become horribly possible. And children have found themselves at the front lines of the colonial experiment. For many years in Canada, First Nations children, Métis and Inuit children, were removed from their families to be brought up in a proper way, in a way that was supposed to offer something more than where they came from. And we know that that is not the case. We know, thanks to the survivors, the 60 Scoop survivors and many others, about the horrors of residential schools. We've heard the story of Shani Wenjack, a child himself, who symbolizes many other children who had the courage and the determination to just want to go home. And some didn't make it. And many of us, when we hear those stories, we wish we were alive back then because we would have done something. We would have not been amongst those that normalized it. We would have not been amongst those who stood by while these children suffered. And we know there were people back then who did speak up. One of the big myths is that people of the period didn't know back then, but that's wrong. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, born just outside of Mount Pleasant First Nation. He is an example of that in 1907, raising the alarm about the prolific deaths of children in residential schools, and that medical science knew just what to do to save them. He gave solutions to the government of Canada. It would have cost $10,000 to $15,000 to save literally thousands of lives, and the government of Canada chose not to do it because it was too expensive. The national budget back then, in 1907, was over $100 million. Now, for those of you who, if you would have seen Cheney or another child walking down the railroad tracks away from the horrible experience of residential school, and say to yourselves, I would have been one of those who stood with him. I would have given him my coat. I would have comforted him, and I would have walked him back home. Then your time is right now. Because there are more First Nations children in child welfare care today than there was at the height of residential schools by a factor of 3. The Canadian government continues to use racial discrimination as a fiscal restraint policy. Now, some may think that's harsh, but I think it's important that we trust ourselves with the truth. You see, the federal government funds public services on reserves, whereas the provinces and territories fund them for all others. And dating back at least to 1907, Dr. Bryce found that one of the undercurrents of the prolific deaths of the children in residential schools was that First Nations people at that time across the country were getting about 1/3 of the health funding that was available to citizens in Ottawa alone. And Dr. Bryce said, even that out, and medical science could make a lot of difference in saving those children's lives. The truth is, those inequalities still persist. Some of you may have seen me on Power and Politics last night, where we were talking about the 2019 budget. And aren't we all grateful that we got $1.2 billion for Jordan's Principle? And I guess I am, but it always makes me wonder, when is First Steps making progress? When does that stop, when Canada's known about these inequalities for 112 years? When do we get to the moment in Canadian history, in our human history, even more importantly, when we say this is no longer morally tenable in a country? It is no longer morally tenable as a human race to say to one child that you get less because of who you are. That is the opportunity in front of us. And the inequalities that these kids have experienced have often become normalized even in the communities themselves, because we've gotten used to just dealing with this inequality. And we have been kind of trying to figure out how to tackle it over the years. It is a toxic potion that leaves children and young people in a position where they can't fully live the lives they wish to have, and being judged by a society that doesn't know any better, as if these kids are getting more already, right? That's the other thing that has been woven into the Canadian consciousness. So why is equity so important? If I decided, you know what, I want to be prime minister, I'm going to have a change of career. And let's face it, I think it's time for the gals to take over, right? No? And I say that coming from a matriarchal society. For thousands of years, we knew men wanted the power and women should control it. And if you ever want to see living proof of that, just go out to a Haudenosaunee community and they'll show you how it's done, right? But if I was to be prime minister, amongst the many challenges that there are, I would actually focus my energies only on one. And that is to reduce the inequalities in our own society. Because by reducing inequalities in our own society, you get a whole wide array of positive things happening. The economy gets better, criminal justice rates go down, things like teen pregnancy go down, people's education rates go up, trust in communities happens, all kinds of people live longer. Cardiac arrests actually go down if you have more equality. And anyone who's had to live paycheck to paycheck understands why that is, right? You know, reducing the inequalities has all these broadband benefits. And that's why we at the Caring Society have focused so strongly on reducing the inequalities that First Nations children and young people do. Because focusing on that one area, we can have all kinds of benefits for these children and for these young people, not only at the age they are now, but as they grow into adulthood and in fact become senior citizens. These benefits are lifelong. This is a report we just did for the Pan American Health Organization. Sir Michael Marmot, who some of you may know, is a chairperson of our commission, and I was privileged to sit on it. And it has all the evidence that we've known, that Dr. Bryce knew even in 1907, that many elders already knew for many years. But what it includes is something very important in terms of an international recognition. We looked at two fundamental tweaks to the determinants of health discourse. One is that we've now included the land as a determinant of health. And this is actually something that hasn't been done in such a kind of prominent way under other determinants of health models done by the World Health Organization and others. And we argue that it's not just important for Indigenous peoples who have known this reciprocity of the land relationship, in fact, to the universe writ large for many generations. But as climate change starts to pile down on the Earth's population, more and more people are starting to understand that we really only have one mother, and we're living on it. So the land is a determinant of health in this piece. The other thing that we did is looked at the structural drivers to inequality. And one of the pieces that we've now named out is contemporary colonialism. We won't find the words post-colonialism anywhere in the report, because none of us really believe that we're in that era yet, anywhere in the Americas. So I commend this report to you. The final report will be out in about June, but the executive summary is already available in Spanish and English through the Pan American Health Organization. Now, lots of election talk now, right, federally. They're all gearing up with these languages, and some of them are telling us that we're broke, or at least we're on our way to being broke. And that's why we can't fix all of the inequalities First Nations children face overnight, right? We've heard this. So one of the questions I've always had is, okay, you know, if we're that broke, then what is First Nations children losing to? What things are more important than them? And if we look around, right now I was just in Ottawa yesterday, which is where I live, and I was actually on Parliament Hill. And I don't know how many billions of dollars, but they're renovating Parliament, right? So that's more important. You know, we can all think of many things that we probably could live without, especially if we knew that children were being racially discriminated against to subsidize it. But there's something else too, and that is that Canada is not doing a good job overall in terms of expenditures of public funds or paying attention in legislation to children. This is a national index put out annually by the Rights Foundation. It rates the amount of attention children get in a particular country proportionate to that country's wealth. And last year, Canada rated 52nd in the world. And if you looked at the sub-index on government budgets and legislation, Canada rated 138th in the world. Now, to put that in context, there's roughly 200 countries in the world, right? So there's clearly a lot of room for improvement. And this gap is not just bad morally, because I think we can all agree that, you know, if Mandela said that you judge a country's character by the quality of care it gives to its children, but it's more than that, it's bad economics. James Heckman, who is a Nobel Prize economist, has shown that the best investment is that little guy going out the door. You are all too old, including you university students. The return on investment in a university student is not that great, right? But the return on investment of a baby or a young child like that, you can get $18 US for every dollar that you invest in a child. When they talk about investments, you know, we have the government balance sheet. You get $18 downstream. That's going to pay off more than the pipeline that they bought, right? And we need to really think about these things when we're thinking about wanting to create a sustainable economy. Because here is the cost at the other end. You know, I can talk about the economics about how these First Nations kids at 30 to 50% less across a whole array of programs. You know, can you believe that Taganega had a boil water advisory for 20 years? Like, that's just an hour and a half outside of Toronto. Like, what is going on, right? We can do better than that. But I think it's really important that we humanize it, right? And to understand that Tina Fontaine should not be defined by the way that she died. She should be defined by the way that she lived and by the person who she was. But there's no question that the multiple inequalities, not only that she experienced, but her parents before her and the trauma that they experienced, and those inequalities not only hamper down on you, they also reduce the level of help that's available when you need it, right? And that's what we saw in her case. If there would have been equality, we don't know if Tina would be here today with us, but it's far more likely that she would have. It's far more likely that she would have. And it's far more likely that during the time when she was alive, she would have had a life that was far more enriching and safe for her. And so this is the price of inequality, right? And it's this inequality that has existed in Canada has existed despite us knowing about it, right? And despite us having the solutions to deal with it. It drives me crazy when I hear politicians, regardless of party, saying that dealing with the inequalities is complex. It's not complex. They figured out how to treat every other child in the country equally. They're doing it already. So why is it so complex for First Nations children? Why is it complex to give them a school without black mold? Right? Why is it complex to give First Nations people clean water to drink? Why is it complex to make sure children have culturally based language and early childhood programs? That's not rocket science. We already know how to do these things, you know, especially on the language front. We have French schools all over the country, right? So we do these things. But there's something stopping us. And I think it roots back to what Robert Williams said at the beginning, that savage-civilized dichotomy, that we have normalized this within Canada. You know, think about it, the fact that we have the Indian Act, right? I am a status Indian. I have a card, but it's expired because I refuse to renew it. I think it is such an egregious human rights violation for the Canadian state to say to someone, your status, or worse, even in many cases, you're not status. That's not a choice for the government of Canada to make. We protested against this internationally in apartheid South Africa without embracing our responsibility for actually having informed that model. They came here to learn from us. And we had people in the street saying, oh, what a great thing we ended apartheid in South Africa. And yet they'll walk by the Indian Affairs building without any kind of emotional alertness. We can see that it's wrong in other countries. We need to see that it's wrong here because there's something we can do about it. So what works when we talk about the overrepresentation of children in care? I think that it's really important that we talk about what is already in all of those reports, and it's not rocket scientists at any way. Equity works, right? And the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the Auditor General, First Nations reports, these inequalities have been calculated out. It's not as if there is some kind of wonder what's the number, right? In some cases there is, but you could deal with the existing inequalities in one budget. They could have done it this last 4 years, and then work from there for the unknown quantities. But there's much more that could be done. So equity is a foundation. Interventions focused on poverty, on poor housing, on multi-generational trauma and addictions, which is a symptom of multi-generational trauma, right? Those are the reasons that drive First Nations kids into child welfare at 12 times the rate. And you notice I'm not using the word Indigenous. I'm doing that intentionally because the First Nations children are far more likely to go into care than Métis children and Inuit children. That's not to diminish the experience of those children. It's just to recognize that that's the reality, and we want to target the interventions for all those children and youth for the things that actually drive them into care. So I think using pan-Indigenous or pan-Aboriginal approaches are not helpful in this particular area. But we need to go at the symptoms, because what has happened in Western child welfare law is we have codified what is structural discrimination as a personal deficit. Let me give you an example. Say if I go to a community in Northern Ontario that does not have water, that is getting funded at their school at say 30 to 50% less than everybody else, doesn't have a daycare center, maybe has a health center, but there's only a nurse there and a doctor flies in a couple times a year. You may or may not have regular electrical power. And I come in and I assess your kids. It turns out they're not that clean because you haven't done laundry for a while. And the reason they aren't kind of personally clean is because when they have a shower, they actually get a skin rash because the water's so contaminated. Now, I come in there and I say, well, these kids don't look like they're properly cared for. Maybe I should send you all to parenting classes, right? Which is really the atypical thing. That's what happens often, right? But I don't do anything about those underlying factors. How much better do you think those kids are going to be doing, right? And I am all about, I actually did frontline child protection work for 13 years. And I am all about holding adults' feet to the fire when they can change things for kids. I need to say that. And I think people who saw me do my work back then can attest to it. But I think it's completely unfair to hold people accountable for things they can't change, right? And that's what we're doing in the criminal justice system. That's what we're doing in child welfare, and that's what we're doing often in the education system. Even in universities like this, or mine, the McGill University. I get frustrated when I see posters of recruitment for First Nations students to come there, but none of these universities are standing up and saying to Canada, you need to end the inequality in First Nations education K-12. Because unless you end that inequality and make sure that curriculum is culturally based and relevant, then you are actually allowing that discrimination to continue, and far fewer children than would like to are not able to pass through these gates through no fault of their own. So we have to deal with the actual source of the discrimination. The next piece is culturally based. I find it so interesting, this whole movement around cultural appropriateness. I remember being puzzled about that when it started to emerge. It sounded good, right? And it was well intended. But you know, I think what it really amounted to in too many cases was taking a Western program that's always assumed to be culturally neutral and then throwing in a totem pole, right? I'm a West Coast girl, so totem poles are our things, right? And in some cases, it was putting in something that was not cultural to us, like smudging. We don't do that, right? I had to learn along with many of you how to smudge, because that's just not my thing. But that's not culturally appropriate for me, right? And what's so interesting is this pronouncement, and I think it's part of that savage civilized discourse, where Western theories in social sciences, Western interventions are proclaimed culturally neutral, and yet our interventions are somehow culturally labeled and are ghettoized or as only being appropriate for Indigenous people, right? Where they aren't seen as being a legitimate pathway of actually remedying some of the gross human rights violations for other groups. I can say that I'm blessed to have seen both. And I think there's a lot that universities can learn by respectfully, I have to add, respectfully honoring those Indigenous cultures and knowledges and bringing them into Western knowledge under the mainstream system. I don't want to see an Indigenous theory course. I want to see a theory course where Indigenous people's knowledges are put on the same level as Western knowledge, right? That's where we need to get to, is de-ghettoizing these types of things and really recognizing their value. Early childhood programs, we talked about this. You're all bad investments, except for that little guy in the back. He's really good, right? He's where we should be putting our money. And that's why I really believe in children. I spend all my time working with children, not just First Nations children, non-Indigenous kids. You know, at the age of 2, children know fairness. Those of you who have kids, right? If you have a 2-year-old and you give two 2-year-olds and one you give 1 chocolate bar to, and the other one you give 2, then you find out what fairness means right away, right? So non-Indigenous children understand fairness, and unlike us, they haven't rationalized it. So they actually see that it's wrong, and they want to be a part of the solution of making things right. And that was part of the bad part of colonization, is it took away that opportunity from many generations of non-Indigenous people to actually see the inequality for what it was and to be active in its solution. And so that's part of what I try to do. And the other is the old home visitor program. It's the only evidence-based intervention we have in child welfare. And you know, the elders would have told you this a long time ago, that sometimes the best thing to do when someone's in crisis is just show up at the door with a bunch of, you know, some food and a pot of tea and sit down and chat. That actually is the most effective child welfare intervention. It's called the Home Visitor Program. David Olds was the author of it. But we haven't come up with anything better. What doesn't work? Well, codifying things as personal deficits. It also doesn't work if we rely on tools. We get excited about tools, right? I think it's because we don't want to deal with all the complications of eradicating systemic inequality, so we'd rather come up with a risk assessment tool and get all excited about that as if that's the next best remedy, right? The other thing that really doesn't work is trying to affirm jurisdiction without providing the funding, right? That's a Bill C-92 is on the table right now. That's the Indigenous Child Welfare Act. And I think First Nations communities, Métis and Inuit communities can control some or all of their children's services, depending on where they're at. But they can't do it without any money. And that's what's on offer right now under Bill C-92, is there's no money in the bill. There's no positive obligations on the Canadian state to provide that money. And then in the budget, there's nothing to develop the laws or implement the laws. So it feels like an empty promise. You need both in order to activate these systems, especially because First Nations families, through no fault of their own, are often at higher need because of residential schools and the current inequalities. We need to bring those folks up to the same level standard as everyone else, and then from there, we'll be able to operate forward. So the other thing I don't try to steer people away from is a focus on reducing the number of children in care. Why, right? Sometimes think, wow, you know, that should be all what you're all about. The problem with that kind of focus is I've heard it before. As you can probably see, I've got a few rings around the tree. When Peter and I knew each other, he was a youth representative, and I was reasonably young for running a national organization. Now, Peter is still a youth, but I am no longer that young, right? And what I've seen is governments will say we're going to reduce the number of children in care. What they'll do is reduce the age of which they'll take kids into care, or they'll heighten the threshold of when children can go into care, but do nothing really to remediate the safety of that family and the child. What I would like us to shift our focus on is healthier nations and healthier families. And by doing that, we're going to naturally reduce the numbers of children in care, but in a sustainable way, right? So that's where we need to go. And we need to understand that child welfare is not about just intervening in a family. It's actually promoting wellness across the whole community and really uplifting, I need to say, those community members, including children, who are already doing amazing work with their communities in that regard, right? These are people on the ground in the grassroots organizations who every day are putting on an extra pot of soup for the kids, who are looking after the neighbor, who are over there giving a helping hand to an elder. All of those people are child welfare workers, right? And then we have the professionals who can come in and augment that. But without one another, they're not going to be able to make it. So one of the things I talk about a lot is moral courage. Part of the reason for that is that I was taught that the most important thing you have in life, that you own in life, isn't a car. It's not your house. And even for a fashion buff like me, it's not my wardrobe. The most important thing that you have is your values. And in order to, those values are very sacred. The commitment to honesty, integrity, the commitment to fairness, generosity, all of those values are sacred. And courage actually isn't a value. Courage is an activator of values. Courage allows you to activate the values when there's some kind of risk for you. You know, there's lots of codes of ethics that you can sign pretty easily when there's no risk on your sunset. But when the chips are down and you could get criticized by people you care about, you maybe could find yourself in a doghouse at the employer, that's when the chips are down and you really get tested as to how much integrity you have for those values. And yet we don't teach moral courage in universities as well as we should. And one of the things that I really try to do is really show people that moral courage is far better a way to live, a far easier way to live than moral cowardice. And we're just going to take a quick exercise here. I'm going to see if you're like me. I have been both a coward and occasionally courageous, and I try to be more courageous all the time. But when I'm a coward, it usually goes like this. Sometimes I'm in a good mood, sometimes I'm crabby, and I'm traveling, and I see or hear something that I know is wrong. I feel myself I should do something. But then I think to myself, well, am I going to make it worse? Is it really my place? All that, this tape grows, and then I don't do anything. Who else has been in that same boat? All right. Now, 2 weeks downstream, are you feeling good about yourself, or are you replaying that whole scene in your mind about what it would have looked like had you actually done that thing, right? Now let's replay the tape. So again, I'm sitting on a day, I might have been in a good mood, might have been crabby, depends on if I'm traveling, I hear or see something I know is wrong. And I know I'm going to take some kind of hit, likely for doing it. But before I can stop myself, I say something. Now, it's 2 weeks down the line. Let's assume that I did or said something, but it failed. How am I feeling about myself? At least better, right? Because I showed someone I cared about them enough to at least try. And I think that's why we have so many self-help programs in professional schools, is because if you don't live with moral courage, you're going to need, there's no amount of yoga that's going to help you, right? You know? That's really the fundamental. If I was to do a self-help class, I would say be morally courageous. And then if you're morally courageous, then you can get by like I do on bath bombs and Hawkins cheesies. And for those of you, you know, not Cheetos, not the puffs in the store. I want you all to write this down for my Christmas list. It's Hawkins cheesies, right? But that test came to us, and we were really gifted by an elder who said to us when we created the Caring Society, he gave us a piece of advice that I try to follow every day. And he said, never fall in love with the Caring Society. And never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the children, because there may come a day when you have to sacrifice both those things for them. And I think that's a difference. You know, we fall in love with the things that don't matter, right? We all end up in these professions because we cared about people, or we cared about a cause, maybe the environment. But somehow these other things, we grow to love them even more, and we're not willing to sacrifice them when the chips are down. And for us, that test came in 2007, when we, along with the Assembly of First Nations, filed a human rights case against Canada for its failure to provide equitable child welfare funding, and for its failure to honor Jordan's principle to ensure that First Nations kids could access public services when they needed them. Within 30 days of filing that case, we lost all of our federal money. And we're still the only national organization for First Nations, Métis, or Inuit that doesn't receive any money from Canada. But that's by choice now. We say we don't need your money. Because I really think that David New was onto something when he wrote the book Accounting for Genocide. And his theory is that Canada really promotes its kind of colonial experiment through funding arrangements, right? And when they cut us, I'm sure that they thought we would be gone within a couple of months. And they were probably really close to being right. I mean, we had $50,000 in the bank. Anything and monies I get from keynotes or anything else, I donate them back to the kids. So that's how we got by. And we just launched a legal case against the biggest law firm in Canada, right? But surprisingly, we didn't die. And I don't think they knew how to manage that, right? You know, when you actually, through some miracle, you actually make it out the other way, they can't control you anymore, right? I think they regret cutting our funding now, right? So the case goes on. The case goes on. I remember thinking to myself that this will take 3 years and then the kids will get what they need. After all, what a compelling case. Children being racially discriminated, getting less public services. The children of residential school survivors, the children of 60 school survivors, not getting the same opportunity as every other parent gets to raise their kids. And we had report after report from the government itself confirming the inequality. What could be easier? Well, they didn't fight it on the facts. They fought it on legal technicalities, right? They brought 8 different motions over a period of 6 years to try and get it dismissed before anyone could hear the case. But on 2016, thankfully, the tribunal issued this landmark decision saying that First Nations children were being discriminated by the government of Canada. And its failure to implement Jordan's principle was discriminatory. It's the only example in the Western world where a nation state has been held accountable for its current discriminatory treatment of a generation of children and ordered by its own courts to stop, right? Ordered by its own courts to stop. Now, something was interesting happening sociologically during this whole case that some people say, well, was that the turning point in the legal case? And I say, no. The turning point happened in 2009. We created a whole social justice campaign called I Am a Witness that I'm going to ask all of you to join. And what we do is we post all of Canada's court documents, all of ours, and we don't ask you to take a side, we just ask you to watch. You could come in person to the hearings. We launched that as we launched the case because we didn't want this case to be argued in silence and argued in darkness. Discrimination likes darkness. It does not like light, especially with the public. But nobody came, really, in the first few years. The courtrooms were empty, other than a few First Nations folks and the lawyers and people like me who are getting cross-examined. The courtrooms were empty. I could hear the echo of my own voice. But that all changed in 2009 when a group of high school students arrived. And one of them, a young man, he was about 15 or 16, comes over to me and he says, "We're from alternative school, which means we get into trouble a lot." And I said, "Good, so do I." And he says, "You know, sometimes we deserve it because we do stupid stuff, but sometimes it's the systems that deserve it. And so many adults are too scared to take on the system. But you are, and you need our help, so we're here." So not only did they stay the full 2 days, they came back the next set of days wearing "I Am a Witness" t-shirts. And by 2012, there were so many children coming to the courtroom that we had to book them in shifts. And the children weren't just there to watch and learn. They were there to be heard. So they would write letters to the Prime Minister about what they had seen in that hearing room, about the type of Canada they wanted to grow up in. And for the non-Indigenous children, we encouraged them to write them in the language that they spoke at home. I'm not a big believer in the white backpack guilt thing, right? I actually think the secret to reconciliation is teaching these children who are non-Indigenous to be proud of who they are, to honor the languages that they speak at home, the customs that they have. Because if they are proud of their culture, they'll understand why our culture is so important to us. And so there would be thousands of children all over the country standing up, and then the adults started to show up on the scenes. But it was the children, first of all, who saw the unfairness and did something about it. And that's where this teddy bear comes in. You see, at the very beginning, alone in the courtroom, I didn't want any of us, including myself, to forget what the case was all about. Kind of like what that elder said, always fall in love with the children. But when you're sitting in a courtroom, it's easy to forget about them. So Carrier Secondary Family Services gave me a teddy bear. So I brought the teddy bear to all the hearings. And when kids come into a courtroom and they see a bunch of adults and a teddy bear, it's not us that they're interested in, right? So the bear would go away. He'd come back with sometimes, sunglasses and fan mail. And he was dressed by the kids over the years. And he became his own personality called Spirit Bear, right? Now, if you are hip, you will already be following Spirit Bear on Twitter. If you are not hip, then you are not following Spirit Bear on Twitter, right? But this is the result of the court with the children's spirit, and I also want to acknowledge that I really feel this case was spiritually guided. There's so many times we were going to do the wrong thing, and something intervened and the right person arrived. I was honored to have lunch with Nick Bala earlier, and he was one of those people who came and helped us out in those earlier days. But Canada's not doing well in terms of its legal winning so far. At the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, we've had 10 orders. The kids have won 9. Canada won 1, and that was overturned. At the federal court, we've had 4 orders. The kids have won 4, and Canada 0. Now, the Federal Court of Appeal, there's been 1 order. The kids won that, and Canada won nothing. So Canada is kind of sadly like our Ottawa Senators hockey team this year. Right? Now, if you were a government, it would make you kind of think, well, maybe we shouldn't be fighting these kids. They're too smart for us, right? Maybe we should just give in and do the right thing. But since that order in 2016, we've had 7 non-compliance orders against the Canadian government. Now, they are making progress on some elements in terms of funding Jordan's Principle. Over 210,000 services were funded, and they put some money in the budget from last year. But that was thanks to the efforts of the children, Jordan's family, and to the tribunal. Those are under court orders. But it just shows you how difficult it is to break the backbone of this colonialism in terms of how deeply ingrained in the DNA the inequality is with government, right? So we're going back to trial. Actually, we've got about 10 to 12 days of hearing set for the next couple months. I'm just looking at my watch. This is a little guy that, really started it off for me, I think, in a sincere way. His name is Jordan River Anderson. He's the founder of Jordan's Principle. And I was introduced to Jordan while he was still with us. He is the son of Virginia Anderson, who's from Peter Ballantyne First Nation. Anyone from Saskatchewan here? No? Oh, there we go. There's our Saskatchewan rep. And so that's where Mom is from. And his dad was from Norway House Cree Nation. Anyone from Manitoba? No Manitoba reps. Oh, there we go. We got both provinces. And he was born in Winnipeg's hospital because Mom had a high-risk pregnancy. And for the first 2 years, he stayed there medically required. And he would have gone home, there's no question. All the services were available if he was a non-First Nations child at the age of 2. But because he was First Nations, Canada said, well, you know, his parents live on reserve. We might have to pay some of it. But is it Health Canada that has to pay for it, or is it Indian Affairs? And then Manitoba said, well, we might want to pay for some of it, but not all of it, and we don't want to set a precedent of picking up a federal cost. So what these governments did is decided to leave the child in the hospital while they argued over each individual item related to his care. And Brian Polstall, who was Jordan's pediatrician, is now the Dean of Medicine at University of Manitoba, was joining with the family, writing letters to the government, trying to say, figure it out later. Like, let this little guy grow up in a family, right? But it was like screaming into silence. Until, as his older sister Jerlene said, just before his 5th birthday, he slips into a coma and he passes away. And from her, she thinks he died of a broken heart. Because other little boys would come into the hospital not feeling very well. They would get better and were able to leave. But he was better, and he was still trapped there because he was a First Nations child. So the family asked that we do something about this. So we worked with them and Norway House Cree Nation, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and AFN, and we came up with Jordan's principle. Very simple. When a First Nations child needs a public service, they should get it. You can figure out all the rest of this stuff later, right? So it gets adopted by the House of Commons in 2007, and then Canada constructs a definition so narrow that no child ever meets the criteria. And then internally in the government of Canada, the deputy minister then gave an award to the public servants for not allowing any Jordan's principle cases. It was the highest public service award that was given in the public service back then. This is 2012. So this type of discrimination was not just normative in the public service, it was award-winning in the public service, right? So the tribunal found that to be discriminatory and ordered that Jordan's principle be implemented. And I'm so grateful to the tribunal because now Jordan's principle is law. It applies to First Nations children on and off reserve. It applies to all public services. And it also understands that, you know what, since these kids have had such hardship, there might be a service that they need that other children can't access. But they deserve it to try and bring them up to the same level, you know? And so substantive equality applies. There's also time frames for which Canada needs to respond to the cases. So there's 3 types of cases for Jordan's principle, in case you're working with a child or know of a child. Individual children can get help. Groups of children can have help. So if you have a group of First Nations kids, say, who need an occupational therapist, you can now apply to get an occupational therapist so they can get the services in their community, right? And then there's retroactive cases. The tribunal said Canada should not profit by its previous discrimination. So if there's a child who should have been eligible for a service between 2009 and 2016 but was denied because of the discriminatory definition, then that child has a right to go back and try to get some service. And that's a critical piece, especially for young adults with special needs, right? Who are now young adults, and had they gotten services, they may have had a better opportunity. How to report a case? Well, there's a 24-hour line, and you can call these numbers any time of the day or week. You can get posters like this that help you go through the process. And even better, on our Jordan's Principle website, some of those children who came to the courtroom have done public service announcements on Jordan's Principle. So not only are they cuter than the ones put out by the Government of Canada, they're actually, you know, really informative. And they're available in French, in English, and American Sign Language. And we really encourage you. You can use them in your classrooms. You can use them in your community gatherings. We're not big on copyright. We just want to make sure the message gets out. So there's a bunch of tools there for you to use. What do we need to do to kind of move forward? Well, we'd like to see more community organizations, they're called navigators, who are community people working in the same community, can help families fill out these forms. They exist some places, but not every First Nation has them. What are some of the challenges? Well, Canada took the definition of all First Nations children and said off reserve, that only applies for children eligible for status under the Indian Act, or eligible for status under the Indian Act. We reject that. We think the Indian Act is a colonial instrument. And I can only speak for myself, but I think it's highly unlikely that in our community, before the Canadian government, that we were measuring people's blood quantum to determine whether they were our nation members. We had far more sophisticated methods of being able to do that than that. So what we want to see is that it's recognition by the First Nation as a community member, that there's recognition of children who are the children of 6'2", right? So that's the cutoff that they have right now. We're saying that next generation should be included. And we want to see a special process set up for children who have been dislocated from their communities due to residential schools, the 60 Scoop, or child welfare, because through no fault of their own, they've been disconnected from the community, but that shouldn't mean that they're denied services again, right? So that's what we're going to be litigating against Canada on March 27th and 28th, and you're welcome to come to those hearings in Ottawa on. There's some other issues with time frame compliance that we're looking at. Just looking at where we are now. So this is the most recent order on Jordan's Principle. We have got an interim motion so that First Nations children who don't have status off reserve but are in life-threatening needs or urgent needs get the services they need. And this was sponsored by a case that actually came out of Toronto where a little baby had really a very rare disorder. 1 in 50,000 children have it. And as a result, her body produces too much insulin. And that can result in comas, seizures, and sadly in death for children. So their doctors recommended that she have a specific scan, a diagnostic scan. And that scan is only available in 3 places in the world. One is in the UK, one is in the US, and one is in Stollery Hospital in Edmonton. So all the family needed is money to get from Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto to get the little baby to Edmonton so she could have her scan. She has to wait around there for a few days and they can interpret the results, and then that would help them be able to decide the surgical intervention that would best help her as a 20-month-old baby. But Canada was refusing to fund this. They said, no, we're not going to pay for it, because even though mom had status and grandma had status, the baby did not have status. So the mom was told this was denied the Friday before the scan was scheduled on a Tuesday. And because there's 3 of these scans in the world, you can imagine the wait list for this, right? This baby had been on the wait list for the scan since she was born. She's now 20 months old. So the request arrives on my table, and we paid for it at the Caring Society. We have no government money. We have 2 full-time employees. But you know, when the other things the elders tell us is when everyone else says no, it's your job to say yes, right? But those are the types of kids that we want to make sure are not left out, right? And I'm happy to tell you that she's doing really well. She had her scan, and she's doing really well, and she's looking after one of Spirit Bear's cousins right now. So that's really what she's doing. And on intervention with child welfare, I know that First Nations child welfare agencies get knocked around a lot in the public media. People say, well, you know, they're not doing the type of work that they should be doing. But that's kind of a codification of that discrimination on First Nations agencies. They have been underfunded so desperately. And I should tell people that despite that underfunding, they remove at far less of a rate than mainstream agencies, right? So they are often doing some really good work, and we need to support First Nations agencies in doing that and doing even better. Because when I go around, they're not interested in doing the status quo. They want to get better too, right? So they now finally, for the first time, have prevention money at actual cost. What they don't have are the buildings to be able to run those programs out of, right? And they also have legal, which might sound like a little bit peripheral, but just to give you a sense of how dramatic the underfunding was for agencies, if you are running a First Nations agency, you got $5,000 for all the legal you needed to do in 1 year. That was for child and care, that was for corporate and everything else, right? So, and for prevention, the maximum amount you got was $35,000. All right? So if you can imagine, communities and agencies wanted to do more. So guess where they got the money? By underpaying their social workers, right? And the social workers allowed that to happen. They knew they could be paid a lot more working for provincial agencies, but they didn't because they wanted to try and work with these kids, and they deserve credit for that. So we're just about finished here. We're going to, as we say, we're still litigating. We're starting to see some progress for Canada. But for me, when it comes to equity, progress is not the key word. That's not the answer First Nations kids deserve to hear. It's that they're worth the money. That's where I want to get to. And that's where the Spirit Bear Plan comes in. In 100, and how many years are we at here with Canada? 169? Are we at 169 now? Or 167? 1867, 1969. I know there's people here with math. So 1867 was Confederation. All these years, we have never, ever had an independent evaluation of INAC. They do their own internal evaluations, which show up some difficulties, but generally show that things are running well. But we think an independent 360 would be critical to really surface out why it is so many times the department doesn't do better when it knows better. Not just on First Nations children, but on land issues and a whole array of things. So that's one part of the Spirit Bear Plan, is change the culture of the department. Reform the department. The second part is get the Parliamentary Budget Officer to cost out all the inequalities and services affecting children and youth. And let's find out what the big ticket is. And let's not be afraid of the big ticket, remembering that each dollar we spend is going to save us a lot more downstream. And then let's develop something like the Marshall Plan. Remember that from the Second World War? You know, like where people tell me things are too complex, I think, well, rebuilding Europe in less than a decade was pretty complex, but they got the job done with the Marshall Plan. So that's what we want to see with this, is that there's a publicly accountable plan for remedying all the inequalities. So we're no longer doing it program by program and drip by drip. It has been adopted by the Gitksan Assembly in 2017. Canada has not adopted it. And they have no alternative plan. And I would suggest to you that without public pressure to adopt the Spirit Bear Plan, it may well be the case that there will be another generation of us sitting here and listening to the same inequalities that have been pressing down on generations before, right? We have to have a plan to get rid of it all. On the bill, there's a great legal analysis by 5 legal scholars from the Yellowhead Institute. And Yellowhead Institute, by the way, is an Indigenous think tank, so they have lots of analysis on language bills and other things. And as you can see, the grades are not good, right? And this is 2019. Now, I get it, where people feel this is a window of opportunity and we should move through it. I want to see this bill pass. But I am tired of offering just mediocre to our kids. And so I, amongst others, have been putting solutions to Canada to raise those grades, right? Because if you had a report card like this at Queen's, you would probably not be getting admitted next year, right? Just saying. So Spirit Bear has gone on to become famous. In fact, when I come to places like this, it already happened to me today, and I don't take any offense. It's, oh, hi, Cindy, where's the bear? Right? So we wrote children's books that actually tell the story of how children came together, all children, and really made a difference. And this is his book. There's a teacher's guide, and there's a coming animated film. And I was saying to people earlier that I've actually hit the pinnacle of my career, because 2 weeks ago, I got to voice one of the bears, right? And so I think like that's the closest I'll ever come to something super cool. And that's his new book. And all the proceeds of these books go to Children's Reconciliation to get more and more children involved. Because you know what the real end of the goal of this is? We can win in the courts. We can have more Indigenous studies programs here. We can have even theory programs where Indigenous studies and Indigenous thought is put on equal footing. But none of that is really going to be sustainable. Because just as that little guy is the best investment in the room economically, children are our best hope for actually giving rise to a country where every kid counts. by raising a generation of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children who never have to recover from their childhoods, and a generation of non-Indigenous children who never have to say they're sorry, and who not only know about the injustices, but importantly have peaceful and respectful tools to address them, not only for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, but other persons for whom injustices are experienced. That is reconciliation. That is our best hope. And so as you leave here tonight, you're going to find bookmarks. I see a couple of them there. Tom has them. And there are 7 free ways that you can make a difference for First Nations children in under 2 minutes. And one of them is coming up on May 10th. You are all going to find your teddy bear. Now, I know you all have them. For those of you who are separated from your teddy bears, you can go to Value Village. There's lots of bears needing to loving families there. You get a bear, you bring it to school, to daycare, or to work. And that is your way of honoring Jordan River Anderson, because teddy bears were his favorite animal. You show that 60-second public service announcement the kids made to educate other people in your circle. And then if you're an adult, you take a picture of yourself and your stuffy. You know, it could be a dinosaur. I have a dinosaur. I won it. That was my one sports success. I won it as skip of the Bear Lake Curling Club. He's about this big. Still have him. My mom had to restuff him. So you take a picture of your stuffy and yourself, and you hashtag Jordan's Principle on social media. And you can have a teddy bear tea party. Read kids the books, right? But do something every day to just remedy these inequalities. Talk to your neighbors. Because I know one thing for sure, that each of these kids is really sacred. And each of these kids is really special. And each of these kids is definitely worth the money. And each of these kids won't be able to grow up in a country where they can feel like they're proud of who they are without each one of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cindy Blackstock. We don't have any questions posted on Slido at the moment, but we could take questions from the crowd.
Yeah. And the only thing I would ask is I can't respond to individual cases for obvious reasons, but if you have any general questions, I'm happy to help to answer them. Nobody wants to debate with me? Maybe I should run for Prime Minister. It looks like there might be more and more openings every day when you watch CBC. I mean, you know.
Okay, we have someone in the back here.
All right.
Hi there. I'm a mom with 2 kids that are 6 and 8, and sometimes we say I'm just a mom. But as one single parent, what are ways that you can suggest to be able to move this work forward in our own community?
Well, I think those 7 ways to make a difference are really key. And I need to emphasize they're completely free. Because one of the things we want to do at the Caring Society, we notice so many NGOs are out there. I get them all the time in Ottawa, right? And they're usually young people in university, no offense. But I see them on the corner, right? And they're usually very friendly. And how's your day going? But they're really not interested in how my day is going. They're interested in how my wallet's day is going. And one of the things I ask them is I say, what can I do if I don't make a donation to help your cause? Because I really believe in the citizenship of every person, right? And I actually don't think money changes the world. I think hearts change the world and hands change the world. So all the things that we do at the Caring Society are completely free for anyone of any age to do. And they're all really meaningful. They've been developed by First Nations. They've been led by First Nations to make a real difference in children. So if you could take those 7 ways and actually do them in your family and spread the word, and also get your kids involved in Bear Witness Day, and another thing we do in May and June, is we ask people to do hearts in memory of the children who passed in residential school, and for you to plant a heart garden. It could be in your flower pot in your home, it can be in the school, it could be in a university. Like, wouldn't it, let's just think about this for a minute. You guys have convocation. Wouldn't it be awesome for the convocation people to walk by a heart garden on their way to into their ceremony? So those are kinds of things you're going to find that we have every month, something kids can do that's fun, that's based on a movement of love, and that would make a difference. And we would be so grateful to have moms like you. And by the way, it's not just you're a mom. Like, what an absolute privilege. I can only speak for myself, but the person I love the most in this world and who's taught me the most is my mom. I'm so grateful to her. Without her, I'm nothing.
So now we have a question on Slido. How did you come up with the 7 ways to make a difference? Is there a significance to the number?
Yeah, 7 ways to make a difference, 1 for each generation, right? Sometimes we switch them out so that we have something current, but that's really our thing, is in honor of the 7 generations kind of philosophy, where you look not only backward, but your actions you judge today are not only done for the children you know. I think that's very different in Western society. People in Western society often want to do very good for their kids and their grandchildren, but they're not taught to love the generation they'll never know, right? Whereas for many First Nations, that's part of our chemistry, is that we have to conduct ourselves in ways that are loving of the generation who will never know. Who's going to drink the water 7 generations from now? Who is going to be the children, my great-great-great-grandchildren? What kind of people are they going to be, and how are they going to relate to the world? And how we came up with them was actually just really picking up on what communities were already doing, right? So Jordan's Principle is one of the 7 ways to make a difference. So we included that in there so that people could learn and sign up about Jordan's Principle. The absolutely great hero of mine, Shannon Kustachin, who advocated for safe and comfy schools, and whose campaign is still going on because equitable funding in First Nations education hasn't been realized. So we work with the families of those children because we really want to honor them and their child's memory. And we create these 7 ways to make a difference. And you know what we realized is the Caring Society is completely non-government funded. And if someone were to come in who is an expert on management, on how to run an NGO, they would be appalled, right? Because we have no fundraising department. We don't spend anything on money, or when we don't write very many proposals. But what we found is when we're inviting people in to do things for free, those who can will make a donation, right? And that has been how we've been able to sustain ourselves. So we continue to make everything available for free, even Spirit Bear's books. All the proceeds go back to the children, and we give out free copies to low-income children, not just First Nations children, but all children. And we also make sure they're in domestic violence shelters and in all children's hospitals. So we do not leave out any child because of their inability to pay. To us, every single kid is just valuable for just who they are. Yeah.
Well, that's not really a question, but a comment. But I think that's a very good idea to let children in the courtrooms as well as judges and other higher up people. And well, like also, that's kind of like the prison farm issue. When the prison farm issue was going on, every citizen was allowed to go in the courtroom.
Yeah.
Well, that was kind of similar to that.
Yeah, and you know what's wonderful about having children in a courtroom is for most children, especially children who came from families who are struggling, the courtrooms are something to feel scared of. It's where your parents got divorced or someone got sent to jail. And then, so the kids would walk in and the children would actually sing in the courtroom, right? So the judges were actually really kind of welcoming of this, I think because many of them had their own kids or grandkids. But the children would actually sing in there, and there were teddy bears. The kids would actually bring their own bear to meet Spirit Bear. And so, and it became a place where children could be a part of seeking justice. And so we had kids in there who actually want to now be lawyers, you know? So good luck to you. You got a whole new cadre thanks to Spirit Bear, right? And I think that that really is important, that we raise a generation of children who understand that they have a right to be witnesses to justice and be a party to justice. And that not just in those rooms, but in criminal courtrooms and other courtrooms as well. So I am just thrilled that they were able to be there. And they continue to come. They're coming later this month. Yes?
I'm continually appalled by the lack of clean water on the reserves. What is the problem? Why can't they fix that? Or what rationale do they use to say they can't fix? I don't understand. Why can't that be fixed like right away?
Yeah, I don't agree with it either. You know, one of the things that's interesting, I heard a variety of rationales over the years. One is that we only live in far-flung places, but then, which is completely untrue, right? Taganega is not a far-flung place. And what is really interesting about it is, like, I have seen Canada, for example, if there is a cyclone or earthquake in somewhere around the world, they have that DART team in the air pumping clean water in 24 hours. So if you can do it halfway around the world, why can't we make sure every kid in this country gets a clean glass of water? I completely agree with you. I think it's a normalization of the discrimination. And I think when Canadians, and I think this is happening, and I'm so grateful for it, when more and more and more Canadians speak out and say, there is no excuse for this, get it done, I think that's when we'll start to see the progress that is going to happen.
Someone in the back here.
Oh, sorry.
I would just like to say about the water thing is I work in the river, and the water that we talk about it all the time in our community I work in, because they have to have boiled water all the time. And what they found is that these people, the government came into the community and put in a water plant. And ever since they started using the water out of the water plant, it has been contaminated. But there still are people in the community that the elders, a lot of the elders, they actually go to the lake and get water and they drink it, and they're doing good. But the water is so contaminated from the water plant that it gives children a rash and other people. So it's got to do with the chemicals that is used in the water plant.
Oh, there's a question on the board. Tom is on it. How do you respond to people who argue and believe it's a fault of Indigenous culture rather than ongoing? Yeah, I get this a lot, especially on the financial side, right? Part of that savage and civilized dichotomy is, well, First Nations don't know how to manage their money, right? It's a chief who's making so much money. And to defeat that argument, you need to go no further than to read Tom's book, because he has a very helpful graph in there about how much chiefs actually make. And I think if people actually knew that, they wouldn't be applying to be chief very often, right? Because it's definitely not on the high end of the pay scale. But there's another piece around that, which I try to unpack. I try to, in my keynotes, actually weave in some of these stereotypes, depending on the audience I'm talking about. And, you know, I say that, you know, there's a worry out there that First Nations chiefs can't manage the money, that they're just putting it in their pocket. It's not getting where it needs to go. But then I point out that the Auditor General has already looked at that First Nations have to have independent audits by accounting firms, and that the vast majority of those come back clean, and that the fraud rate is lower than it is amongst municipalities. And then the other thing I say is, look, I live in Ottawa. All right? It's not as if there are absolutely First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who are not managing their money well, and some are probably criminally involved. But we're not alone in that. But that was so interesting to me when that First Nations Accountability Act was being talked about in Ottawa. You know, the one with the financial disclosure and everything else. And the narrative was, well, we're not going to give them more money until we can make sure we can be accountable for it. That's at the same time, 3 mayors in Quebec went off in handcuffs, right? And there was nothing from the federal government saying we need a white man Financial Accountability Act, right? You hold the wrongdoers accountable, but you don't do a whole cultural policy on the basis of that wrongdoing. I think that's one of the things I try to do is illuminate that, but use the real facts and figures. I find a lot of people are open to the information. They just have never questioned these stereotypes. And there are a few people that I get involved in Twitter wars with every once in a while, especially if I'm crabby. I remember one guy wrote in, he said, well, these kids aren't entitled to my tax dollars. And I wrote back and I said, even you, sir, are entitled to my tax dollars. That's how it works. You know? I am an MPA student, and the program is training me to join the public service. There are many excellent public servants. And I think one of the key pieces is that idea of moral courage and integrity. With that, if you fall in love with the public, then you will be a good public servant. If you fall in love with the minister, you are not going to be a good public servant, right? So I am really happy you're an MPA student, and I hope you do go into the public service, because we all need good people in there. And there are good people in there now. And that's one of the reasons I want the Department of Indian Affairs to have an audit, because there are lots of good people who go in there, but they can't stay because the ethic isn't right. And we want to keep those good people in the public service, right? The work you do is not funded by the government. Is wanting to have these programs government funded a contradiction? No, I don't think so. Because everybody gets, we've decided as a country that every child deserves to get a public education. Every child deserves to be able to get clean water. When my neighbor's house was on fire and I called 911, they didn't ask if he'd paid his taxes, you know, or if he was wanting to be government funded. There's certain public services we've decided that everybody gets. And I'm saying that that should apply equally to First Nations children, right? I think it's actually good that we're not getting any government money, because we're not taking anything away from those kids, right? We want to see all the public money go to the children, go to the families, go to the communities. It doesn't need to come to organizations like mine. And even if one day we don't exist anymore, that's okay, right? Because organizations are not like people. They shouldn't live on forever. They're only here for the time that they're needed. And so Spirit Bear, of course, will live on forever, but the rest of us will find other things to do.
So I'm a second-year law student, and I also have a passion for youth and children, and hope to get into child welfare and youth justice in the future. So I was wondering, and I see some of my classmates, some of my professors this year for children's law. So I was wondering what advice you have for law students who want to get into this area of law. Just what general advice do you have? Because I find a lot of times, reading cases, I get very discouraged reading about cases like Tina Fontaine and reading the report that came out. It's upsetting, and I think there's obviously progress happening, but also, it can be discouraging. So I was just wondering what advice you have for law students.
Is fall in love with the kids. It really is that easy. When we filed this case, I wrote the complaint. I remember, and don't let the barriers get in your way. I knew that the Indian Act was prohibited from filing a complaint. You couldn't file a complaint under the Canadian Human Rights Act because the Indian Act was linked to that, and you couldn't do it back in that day. So being as naive as I was, I just didn't mention the Indian Act. I thought, that's fine, I'll just send this thing in, we're not going to mention the Indian Act. And it worked, right? I think that really where we need good lawyers at both levels. We need lawyers to work with the individual children, youth, and families, but we also need lawyers to deal with the structural issues like the human rights abuses. And that's where I've decided to put my work. In many ways, I feel I'm doing the same kind of work I used to do with families, but it's at a macro level where hopefully I can free up some space for more line workers to do the important work with families and have the resources to do it. So I'd really encourage you to look at human rights law. And I've not taken off the table actually bringing a charter case against Canada if necessary on the inequalities, right? I think if I've always said, you know, I don't want to litigate against Canada, but if it's another legal case, I think I have another 10 to 15 years in me, and the kids are worth it, right?
We have time for one more question from the floor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, nobody there.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a person in the back.
Hi, this is a related issue. It just popped into my head. One of the most sad things that I've seen happen to people is the parents whose children are removed. And I've seen people literally destroyed by this. Is there anybody doing any work on this? I've never seen somebody come back from that.
Yeah, you know what? There's two parts of that story, and I think that one is that we really need to really start at that front end in promoting healthy families. Because I'm not a utopian thinker. I think some First Nations kids need to be in care, right? I do. But on that other side that you're talking about, there are a lot of women's organizations, particularly Native women's organizations, who have done good work working with families. And in Winnipeg, they have, and some of the child welfare organizations now with prevention money are creating supports for moms and dads who've had their kids removed. Because what often happens, you've probably seen it, where the child removal, maybe the family has addictions issues, and then the kids get removed, and then it just goes down from there, right? They feel like they have no more reason to be able to do it. When I was doing child protection work back a long time ago, in the downtown east side, we actually had a good model there that I'm hoping that they will bring back. And that was, I did only intake, so I did the assessments of the child maltreatment reports, and there were specialized teams. So there was actually a mental health worker and a social worker to go out to those cases, an addictions worker who could also come out. We had a teen intervention worker. We had all of these different professions that could go out and encircle the family. And the other thing that we had an access to is after we did a removal, we could call a team in to support the family, right? So those kinds of programs, I think that we really need to resurface. And one thing I would note related to your question in yesterday's budget is I think we're going to see something along those same lines for recommendations in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Inquiry, but there was not a penny for the implementation of those recommendations in yesterday's budget. So as much as we can kind of advocate with our members of Parliament, and I know it's an uphill battle here with our provincial government, but you know what? We got to keep on them too, right? So to make sure that those kinds of supports are there, because I really want to, at a minimum, I think we owe it to those families and to those who are lost to make sure this doesn't just become another one of those reports that sits on the shelf. All right, I think that we have snacks waiting for us, right? You know, and so I think we should get to that. But you have a Prezi, and I love presents.
Oh, yeah. On behalf of the MPA 2019 class, I'd like to say Nyawa Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being such a great host. You know, you did fantastic. Wasn't she great? She was great. Thank you.